Hello, dearest listeners. Asteria here. I'm just wrapping up some very important cosplay for Dimension 20 on a bus. I've been looking through the Daggerheart subreddit, and one of the discussions that keeps popping up is what Daggerheart GMs can do when their players roll fear. Anytime a player rolls with fear, the GM gets a fear token. I have my little fishy bowl of tokens. And in combat, when a player rolls with fear or fails a roll, that ends their turn, their spotlight, and the GM gets to go. But also, the GM gets to make a move, introduce a complication of some sort, get a token, and whether or not the roll succeeds or fails, it goes a little less smoothly than the player and the player character had hoped. Some might simply say it goes worse than they'd hoped, but we're all here for a good story. So we like a complication. This can be pretty nerve-wracking at times for GM. It's one of the spots in Daggerheart where there's a little bit of pressure. And the Daggerheart materials have great examples of what constitutes a GM move, soft moves, hard moves, etc. So I'm not going to rehash that, but I am going to rate myself. I am going to go back through parts of the second episode of our podcast, Queen of Daggers, Heart of Fire, and look for all the parts where my players rolled with fear and see what I did and if I think I would do things differently now. Just you and me on today's episode of Duality Bites.
Duality Bites.
So our second episode, Howl, was recorded in November 2024. Playtest rules, and the second time we'd properly played. We did a little bit of play in our second session 0, but we were really figuring things out as we went. Some small spoilers inevitable, but I don't think you'll need too much context to get the idea. So the very first roll with fear we have in this episode is David playing Orlean, doing his mycelial array for the first time. He is a reflavored fungal, and he's reaching out to his network to see whom he can contact. Now, then as now, rules as written, it's an instinct roll to successfully reach out with your mind to speak to those of your ancestry. So here we go.
Okay, that's 2d12s, right?
Yes. And you're trying to hit a 12.
Okay, so it's a fear roll, and the total is 11. But then that's +2 for instinct, right? So that's 13.
So this is the first time you've ever played with them with an intent, or, when you sense that now is the moment, that something has been unlocked, roll them, you feel this frisson, cast them out, and you sense that this thing you hadn't been able to articulate you were attempting has worked. And you know that you can, in your mind, you don't have to say it out loud, can communicate something to someone who's like you, no matter how far away they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, who do you think that is, and what do you communicate?
I think I want to address the consciousness whose confusion we are sensing in the earth of the walls. That I am sensing in the earth of the walls. You said I sensed that the walls were confused. I want to try to address who or what is feeling that confusion.
Yeah, that will work.
Okay.
There's no textual limitation on, we'll see how it goes,
Okay.
on how much you can say.
Okay. I want to ask it first, what do you see?
Do I see in Great's blood my realm, my resistance, impudence, reign, where's reign? Cosmonaut. Wait! You hear a whooshing sound. I'll tell you now that that whooshing sound tells you have lost this being's
The
attention.
connection, yeah.
Yeah, it would. You could roll again. A 12 is not that high. You could talk to them more. You might not get their attention again. It was a big question. They saw a lot.
Yeah. I'm not sure what to do with that information.
That is very fair. So you can tell it's a little unclear whether I made a GM move at all. He succeeded and was able to communicate. We got caught up with what this meant because he's not a literal fungal, and we hadn't discussed what it meant, and there were some things that I wasn't ready to reveal. Now, I think what's represented by the roll with fear is that the conversation he had was not what he had hoped. It wasn't a very fruitful conversation. I did give him coded information in there, but it was a short, not very pleasant conversation that was cut off before he could respond. And I think, for me, I'm pretty actually happy with what I did there, especially since it was so early in the episode and his first time using that feature. I wouldn't have wanted to be punishing or discouraging, especially on a success. It was a foreboding response and not a back and forth conversation. So yeah, cryptic info, and then he lost the person's attention, but satisfies the rules as written and gives him more information. Yeah, I'm going to give myself a thumbs up on that. Next, we have our first combat roll with fear. This is Lemma, played by J. Ben, attacking a shadowy monster. Because of the premise of the campaign, they can't quite fully see what they're looking at. I will tell you, lovely viewer, listener, that we're dealing with a Strix Wolf. This is another success with fear. Lemma does hit. It's 2 weapons, or we're doing it rapier dagger style. And the way I expressed the fear was that the weapons got lodged in the sizable trunk of this creature.
That is a 3 hope, 11 fear plus 2, so 16 would be.
That hits. As the dagger sinks in, you get distinct feeling of feathers and fur, both. You feel the feathers of the wing, but it's a strange kind of fur into which the dagger sinks. You get a growl and a very raptor-like roar. You're in close because of the rapier, are you not?
Yeah, I charged right in.
So it is going to attack you back. What is your evasion?
My evasion is 10.
Which is what I'm trying to hit. And I rolled a 7 with a +2. You hear a clack next to your head that misses. That is the strange creature's turn. Evelyn would definitely do what is second nature to her, which is to try to figure out what she can figure out by looking at this thing, by observing the way it interacts with Lemma. It seems like Lemma has done well, but has committed to a dangerous range. Now, I checked back, and I did not give the adversary any mechanical bonus on their attack. What I did do, I immediately gave the Strixwolf a turn afterwards, which is what you're supposed to do on a roll with fear. And that might be enough. I also made clear that Lemma had complicated things. She was kind of stuck up close, fighting an enemy who was good up close, and if more showed up, probably had pack tactics. So I didn't give it advantage on its attack roll, but I had Lemma less mobile than he might want to be. Now, we definitely had some confusion about how combat was supposed to work at the time. This was at the point where we knew the action tracker would be done away with, but those rules hadn't been released yet. Now we know that the thing to do is transfer over Spotlight from the PC to the adversary and add a consequence to the fear roll. I might now go a little harder and give the adversary like a +2 to the attack roll, but I think at least narratively I honored the fear. So given the circumstances, I feel fine about that. Now we have Orlean again with a sense roll since he's a druid, kind of for naturey stuff. He got a 14 with fear to try to figure out what these dire wolves were up to. It was a general request, one that's often hard to adjudicate for a GM, and a 14 is a number that's a little bit hard to adjudicate as well. Fun fact, David, who plays Orleon, this is his first ever experience with TTRPGs, and I think he's doing incredibly.
So it's 2d12s, right?
Correct.
Okay. Hope is a 4, fear is an 8. So it's a 12 total, plus I suppose that means 2. I get 2 extra for it, right? So that's 12, so that's 14.
All right, that's with fear, so thank you.
Yes, but also know that I have know that.
Oh, right.
Which says roll with fear and add a token to spend +1 on an action roll. I don't know if I need that here, though.
It's something you should track. So I've asked David to reflavor the Seaborn community, dear listeners.
We both got a little caught up talking about his Know the Tide feature from his community, so I lost track of actually using the fear. I'm sure I took a token, but I didn't do any sort of GM move, so whoops. So I would do that differently. Now we have another combat one. This is Ginny, played by Carmela, my co-hag, co-producer. Ginny has just had a pivotal, triumphant moment that I won't spoil.
Okay. I'm gonna attack this wolf.
I thought you fucking might.
Yep.
And then she wallops a direwolf with a 20 with fear and does some cool stuff to extra damage in. I didn't do anything particular as a GM move with the fear. I did transition away from that scene afterwards to Evelyn and Lemma with the Strix Wolf, but that wasn't really to Ginny's disadvantage. And honestly, I think that fit the moment perfectly fine because it was so triumphant for Ginny. And I don't really regret not doing a GM move there, though in most circumstances I should. And finally, this one's kind of interesting. Towards the end, Lemma rolled an instinct roll, sort of an insight, on Poet Hawthorne to see if this NPC was perceiving the strange mystical things as they were. He got a 16 with fear. And I'm going to say that I did kind of a behind-the-screen GM move, an undisclosed GM move. Gave J. Ben a very short answer that he seemed to find fair. And if memory serves, I used the fear roll to feel better about just changing the subject. And that's actually one of my favorite ways to use fear, is to feel better about doing the things I want to do. I think of them as a drama queen tax or a railroading tax. Cheating tokens. No, I won't say that. In fact, let's just hear another point in this episode that I use fear when there's no roll. Just, as a GM move, perhaps what the book would call a golden opportunity. See what you think.
Lemma stares straight at you, grips your hand a little too hard, and says, "So the path twists, we return to the doorstep we left from," and bounds up and sprints off.
Evelyn runs after. I am going to actually make a GM move, sort of. I would like to countermand the very end of that, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You have each done very impressive things. The dire wolves in this square have been mopped up. And you are on the route to Poet Hawthorne's house. And if it's all right with you, I will burn 2 of my fear, which advantages you to say, as you are about to dash off, Lemma, you are faced with an agitated Poet Hawthorne. Certainly, he's at 6s and 7s, rallying a hue and cry. What are you doing here? There's so much danger everywhere. Why are you not in bed? Get inside. Get inside, children. And he ushers you into his cottage. Surprising authority, and I mean, he's an authority figure, but he turns you about with unexpected strength, likely from direwolf-related adrenaline.
So I spend fear. I spent 2, which is really not necessary, but this was new for me and it just made me feel better, and I had a lot of fear. To interrupt a scene and say, actually, you don't do that, here's what happens instead. Before you leave, this happens, so you're unable to leave. But I do tend to spend a fear to make something coincidentally happen at the perfect time, when the player's actions haven't caused it specifically. You know, kind of a cinematic moment that helps move the story along and enable a scene that I want to make happen. And that's why I sometimes think of it as a drama queen tax. In episode 3, I use fear this way just to have a cool visual that I think is a little cheesy. Or a railroading tax, which I use very tongue-in-cheek. We're not getting into railroading arguments, but I think that makes things feel better for everyone, saying I'm not moving you around like dolls in a dollhouse, but I can make things happen too in this story. And it's not bad that this person shows up when he does, which is another reason I should not have spent 2 whole fear. It probably made it seem much more ominous than it was. I just was not ready for the players to reunite. I wanted them to talk to this character first. So those are some pretty representative ways of me using fear, and some pretty representative ways of me having skipped over GM moves. I do find that knowledge and instinct type roles are often where it's trickiest to make a GM move. There are also areas where people are often unsure if they should be a role at all, which is a very valid question, and one that I just think you need to experiment with and be gentle with yourself. We get way too into always and never in TTRPG conversations, and I don't think it is any sort of sin to call for 1 or 2 more roles than the book technically says a GM is supposed to. If you do that, it'll be fine. It really will. Just do your best and love your story and love your players. And be a little bit mean. Wink. Thank you for listening to Duality Bites, a production of Hagdeal Gaming. If you like what we're doing here, come say hi on Blue Sky or TikTok at Hagdeal Gaming. Leave us a review. We'd love to know what you think. And remember, as a wise person once said,
I sensed that the walls were confused.